Hello, everyone, and welcome to A Mind of Her Own. Before we jump in, I just wanted to remind you that my book, Guilt Free, comes out in January 27th, 2026. So I hope you check that out. Really focused on helping women manage guilt. And I think so many of us can experience that, do experience that. And I want to talk about it a bit today with my guest, who's Dr. Caitlin Massone. She's an ultra marathon runner, mountaineer, a neurologist specializing in the treatment of patients with stroke, and first time author of Running from Perfection. So hold up here, my journey from eating disorders to endurance sports and the neuroscience behind it. So, in her book, she shares the story of her 14-year battle with eating disorders and how nature and endurance sports aided her recovery. So, Dr. Massone, thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you for having me. I'm great. Happy to be here.
Well, I love the book. I think it is beautifully written, sharing your story. There certainly are very challenging times you describe in it, but I just found it so readable. I just want to congratulate you. I know it's your first book and maybe first of
Yes.
many, right?
Yes. Thank you very much. I appreciate that.
Awesome. So, wanted to kind of jump right in. I mean, I think you really write so openly about your challenges with eating disorders throughout those 14 years. Can we start with, I know that leading up to and into your sophomore year of high school, there was a pretty major change in your family, and you really saw that as one of the triggers for some challenges with your eating. And I wonder if we could just start there.
So just kind of as a precursor to that, just the way I grew up and the kind of child I was I was always a bit of a perfectionist. The first chapter in the book is titled Little Miss Perfect, and it was really an apt nickname at that time in my life. I really was an engaged student, an engaged child, sibling, you name it. I was always striving to be really good at whatever I pursued. And that worked really well for me until it became kind of a double-edged sword when it, kind of turned into dieting and led me down the path towards anorexia. So when I was 16, my dad essentially abandoned our family, and he left not only physically but financially, kind of deserted us at that time. I was living at home with my siblings and my mom, who really was, I guess you would consider her a homemaker in terms of her career at that time. She didn't have a college degree to fall back on. And when my dad left, we really struggled financially, and she was just essentially trying to make ends meet by cleaning houses. And at that time in my life, it really was caused a lot of turmoil. I was used to being in control of my environment and kind of being at the top of my game in terms of my achievements. And this sudden wrench in all of that really caused a lot of chaos in my life. And, looking back on it, when I chose to start restricting what I was eating, I kind of looked at it benignly, like, oh, well, it's just a diet. Maybe I'll lose a few pounds. And my teenage brain really didn't interpret that at that time, but I was really just trying to regain control amidst all of that chaos and turmoil. And so that was kind of one of the main triggers that I can identify in terms of when the anorexic behaviors started.
Mhm. And you write about that, your friends calling you Little Miss Perfect, and some of those challenges really being a high achiever and finding that if things weren't perfect, it really triggered a lot of anxiety for you.
Yeah.
And so I imagine when things were very much not perfect in that transition, when your father abandoned your family, like you said, physically and financially, that must have been a really difficult time from an anxiety perspective.
Mhm.
And so, like so many kids do, like even adults do, right? We try to find ways to cope with the way that we're feeling. And it sounds like your management of anxiety in this case was to try and find control somehow.
Mhm.
Why do you think it focused on the eating behaviors? Why do you think that became such a focus for you?
Um, I think there's a couple of reasons. One was just in terms of being a teenaged female, I was built very muscularly. I was always a soccer player. I was athletic. And so at 150 pounds, I was very muscular. And while I look at that now as a positive in terms of my ultra marathoning career in mountaineering, at the time it was could be often a source of ridicule from other kids my age, right? And as I mentioned in my writing, back then, picking on other people and teasing was done face to face. There was no social media to kind of hide behind. And so a lot of that I just kind of took upon myself as, okay, well, others see my body as imperfect. So maybe that's something that I need to work on, right? And then the other piece to that was that, when my dad abandoned us, not only was there financial insecurity, but there was food insecurity. And I think the timing of that, on top of me already having some insecurities as a teenage girl, really just compounded that. So, we went from having a fully stocked fridge and pantry to all of a sudden having this kind of like feast and famine cycle where, we would live paycheck to paycheck. And when there was food in the house, we ate abundantly. And when there wasn't, we restricted. And I think, some of the restrictive behaviors, I kind of found that in what we had available, but then kind of just, again, just started cutting out different food groups and taking it far, in excess of what should have been.
Mhm. And I think we do underestimate how often food insecurity can lead to disordered eating patterns. And I know I've talked with Una Hansen, who writes a lot about
Mhm.
diet and about body image, and that really can be a big factor in it.
Mhm.
You also mentioned in the book that your mother really struggled with her body image and maybe at a time had her own challenges with anorexia. How did that show up for you as a kid and what you witnessed?
Yeah, so my mom's struggles with anorexia were predated my existence. I think that was more when she was younger. But she always valued thinness, and saw restrictive eating in some ways almost as like a badge of honor, right? As in, like, I don't have to eat this. I have more self-control than someone else does, right? And so, those behaviors, while she wasn't actively anorexic at the time that I was going through that, I think kind of stayed with her. And she couldn't recognize when I was becoming thin excessively. It was only years later, after I think another soccer player's mom had mentioned to her, she's getting very thin. Are you concerned? And then it kind of just opened her eyes to that. So I think, while there was never any overt like weight related comments from my mom or anything negative that would have pushed me towards dieting, there must have been in some way a little bit of imprinting of that, and her not necessarily acknowledging the fact that I was anorexic.
Mhm. Yeah, and I think you describe what so many kids also feel, which is, did I do something wrong that led to this fracturing of my family? Was I not good enough? Were we not good enough as a family? And just guilt that came up around that. And I think obviously I've been thinking and writing a lot about guilt, and one of the things I talk a lot about is that it's based on our expectations and why we carry those. Where are those coming from, right? It's not that women are doing this to ourselves, is that we're facing expectations, and one of the sort of four main types are just what you commented on. This, you need to have self-control. You need to be working toward perfectionism in self-control in your bodies and your minds and your behaviors and your drinking, your shopping, your whatever it might be. And I think that that's something that we all pick up as we're growing up, especially young girls, the sense of we need to be in control. Can you talk a bit more about just sort of how that guilt played into some of these choices and behaviors in high school and beyond?
Yeah, I think just during the phase in which I was anorexic, I'll first speak about the guilt there. I would say there was definitely, again, the mismatch between what my expectations of myself were at that time versus the reality. So it was a matter of, like I said, being a high achiever and just trying to excel at everything possible. And then, when my dad left, I think every kid has these questions that go through their head that they never voice. Like, is this in some way my fault? Was I not good enough? Why, did my dad leave because we weren't enough for him? Right. And while I now realize that that's kind of arbitrary and that had nothing to do at all with my parents' divorce, right? At the time, I was feeling guilty as if I wasn't a good enough daughter, and in that aspect, that kind of there was some guilt there, and that definitely played a role in feeling anxiety, depression, and then into the eating disorder. Um, I would say also, just commenting on guilt later on in my life, this came up again during the phase when I was bulimic. So I was anorexic for a period of years. And then during medical school, I started binge eating and becoming bulimic. And that carried through through the entirety of med school and residency. And the guilt that I felt there, again, had to do with this mismatch of expectations where, again, I was high achieving, I was chief resident. I was doing very excellently, clinically and academically. And everyone still thought I was, little Miss Perfect despite these bulimic behaviors. And so I had a lot of guilt, not only about, comparing myself to my peers at that time, but also feeling like as a young female doctor that I was basically selling a lie where I wasn't, I wasn't a healthy person. And I was trying to be that like pillar or example for sick patients in the hospital. And to me, that was probably some of the worst guilt that I felt, was that I felt like I was in some way being hypocritical or not, being an example for my patients.
Mhm. Yeah, I think there's a lot of pressure on healthcare
Mhm.
providers to not only project the image of perfection, but also to really be optimally healthy, mentally healthy, physically healthy.
Right.
And I think that pressure is there. You write about when you're a teenager, this sense of I thought, losing weight would make me happy, would help with my anxiety, would help with my depression. And it very much was the opposite, right? That those things did worsen. Now you're looking through this lens of as a neurologist, and how would you sort of comment on the brain in as teens, right? And sort of what transition we're in during those years that can make these sort of behaviors really sticky?
So I like to think about, a lot of things in terms of habit formation related to your brain age. And I think that as a teenager, we're in this period of vulnerability in terms of our brain age and our ability to make decisions. And that's because neurodevelopmentally, some parts of our brain, which are more prone to like impulsivity and risk taking and almost like reactionary decision making, that's more prevalent when you're a teenager. And then as we get older and our frontal lobes continue to develop, we develop the ability to maybe put some of those impulses in check or make better decisions or more rational thinking. And so, unfortunately, as teenagers, when we start to form habits or we're exposed to different things, albeit drugs, alcohol, sex, our brains are simply more likely to form habits at that age. And that's again just based on that neurocircuitry that kind of potentiates that habit formation. So unfortunately, like I said, the habits tend to stick when we form things like addictions or other habits at that age.
Mhm. And you describe, I think, a time where you did go and speak to a therapist about some of these challenges. And it doesn't sound, I mean, I don't know how many times you connected
Yeah.
with someone or if you ever found someone that you really liked working with, but it doesn't sound to me, per the reading, that that really was a place for much support or comfort for you or treatment. And I'm just wondering if you could share a bit about why it wasn't helpful for you and maybe even in this ideal world, what would you have wanted to receive or hear, or what could have been helpful for you then?
Yeah. I never want to belittle, the therapies that we do have available for eating disorders because I think, psychotherapy and antidepressants do have a role. And I think that people who stick with those therapies and they work, that's great. I think for me, it was just that at that time in my life, I would say I was not fully committed to those therapies, and I wasn't very patient with the process. One thing that's key is when for anorexic people or people with anorexia, they often don't seek treatment because the symptoms and behaviors are kind of egocentric, right? Like we look in the mirror and we see validation that weight loss is working and we're in control, so we don't want help. And so I really didn't even start to seek therapy until I was binge eating and bulimic because those behaviors were ego dystonic and not aligned with what I wanted in my life, right? And they were very disturbing. So when I went to therapy, I think I just didn't give it the time and patience that it warranted. I did a few sessions with an individual sessions with a psychotherapist, as well as some group therapy, which was more focused on kind of art therapy and other mindfulness behaviors. And unfortunately, I think I just didn't give them the time that they really needed. Even today, now in a recovered state, like I do mindful activities and art therapy on my own that I find are very, stress reducing and help with anxiety. And I think I probably just didn't give it much of a chance. Um, I will say now things are a lot different than they were 25 years ago when I was trying to find a therapist. And I think some of some newer things that would appeal to me more if they had been offered would be things like nature-based interventions or ecotherapy, especially with my background of having been, a nature lover and an athlete as a kid. If someone told me, hey, we're going to go for a walk in the forest and we're going to, just sit and relax and be mindful, I do wonder if something like that would have been a little bit more helpful, but it simply wasn't something that was offered at the time.
Yeah. And I found some moments through here where there was a sense of regret, like the wishing that maybe a coach at that time or teacher or someone, I mean, I know your mother's bandwidth was pretty limited as she was trying to just keep food on the table, but the sort of wish that coaches or someone would have maybe checked in with you a bit more or asked about it. I'm wondering if you could share a bit about those feelings.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, I think it's hard because, throughout the process, both with anorexia and bulimia, I was always aware that that wasn't right, and so I was aware that I was too thin, or I was aware that I was eating too much. And so it was never lost on me. Like I knew there was a problem. And so a lot of these behaviors are just so secretive and shameful that you don't go up to your coach or, on soccer and say, listen, I'm really struggling. I could use some help with X, Y, or Z. And so it was a really hard time, knowing that there were people around me that could have played a role in that. Or helped me seek counseling, or maybe had me skip a season of soccer to seek help. Um, but I don't feel like at the time I really was too focused on that. I think that's more in hindsight that I look back and think, if I had been that coach or that parent, it's always easier to say now, like, I wish I would have reached out to that person. It's hard to say. But yeah, it was definitely a trying time.
And you write about when you were, I think, either a medical student, I think I'm a medical student, and you were on a psychiatric floor, and you actually were working with a patient who came in struggling with bulimia. And I'm
Right.
wondering, you describe in there really feeling the sense of shame, like you were
Mhm.
hiding your own challenges.
Yeah.
I'm wondering if also on the flip side, if your ability to empathize, I mean, even thinking about your practice today, like how do you think these challenges you face, these habits you've had to fight so hard to move forward from, like how does that affect your care with patients, do you think?
I mean, I think I'm definitely more of an empathetic person than I was at the time. Like I definitely, while I could relate to that, the girl with bulimia that I saw in the ward, I didn't have the voice at that time, or the power of having gotten over that to really communicate with her on a level that made me seem empathic.
Mhm.
I think now I have much more of that skill when it relates to. I mean, if you look around, a lot of people every day are struggling with issues of body image and self-esteem and weight-related issues, even if it's not necessarily an eating disorder. So I think I can relate to that struggle more of, when you tell patients, okay, part of this counseling or part of prevention is to lose weight. Well, I know that that's not easy. And, or saying, oh, well, you need to stop drinking alcohol because, this is causing you, liver problems or this or that. Like coming from that background of having that habit or addiction it makes you realize that that is not an easy thing to do. And I definitely feel for those people in that position.
Yeah. You describe when you, I think, did your or moved to Denver after you had done some of your training and really had a year there. It seemed to me like that was a major kind of shift for you. That really was where your recovery began. But I'm wondering if that is the case, or, kind of you can talk about when you started to shift toward recovery from
Yeah.
the bulimia.
Yeah, I think I will say there are many factors, but Colorado was a very healing place for me. And I think part of that comes in the fact that I had a huge shift in my life at that time. I was pursuing my job and my new career, but also physically removing myself from an environment which had become toxic, like where my bulimic behaviors had really been potentiated, I think was really helpful. Part of what I talk about in the book, as you know, is about the healing effects of nature. And I think when you're living in a city, as I was for 5 years, living in Philadelphia and being quite literally gridlocked into this small area and, you know, not having access to nature, I think Colorado was just the inverse of that. And it really opened my eyes to the potentials of being outside and exercising again. Those were just things I really didn't think of when I lived in Philadelphia.
Hmm.
So I think Colorado was a big part of that healing process, and just physically removing myself from, that environment just allowed me to take a step back and say, okay, well, this is a completely fresh start. So if I'm going to change a behavior or change the way I'm thinking, today's the day to do it. And that's literally how I approached that.
Hmm. And really getting back, I know when you were younger, running was something that did help you with your anxiety and was
Yeah.
useful for you. And then, ironically, as you're focused so much on your body, and yet the weakening that happened from not eating, from really restricting, and even from bulimia, that you became less capable of going out for a run or things like that. And I'm wondering what it was like to kind of go from how you were feeling to slowly rebuild
Mm-hmm.
that strength, that endurance, that clearly you have in spades now. But what was
Right.
that like to regrow that?
Yeah, I mean, it was very interesting. So I will say when I lived in the city, I would exercise, but it was very monotonous exercise on a treadmill where I would kind of just methodically check off 3 or 5 mile runs and go home and call it a day. And so I never really saw the healing or empowering aspects of, exercising when I was living there. But when I moved out to Colorado, I started running more outdoors and running on trails. And certainly I did not have the endurance when I first started doing that. It was kind of just, well, put one foot in front of the other and see how far you get. And to start, that was a short distance. But I found that, the more I ran, not only did I build that endurance both physically and mentally, but I found running to be the most empowering thing that I've ever found in terms of making me feel comfortable in my skin and love my body. Like I just feel like, when I run, I feel powerful. I feel like my body's so capable, and it doesn't matter what it looks like in the mirror. I mean, it really has been just a remarkable transformation through that exercise.
And I know you fell in love with someone who was living back in New
Yeah.
Jersey and ended up returning after a year, right, from
Mhm.
Denver to New Jersey. And
Yeah.
there you are back sort of or some, close to that environment that was so
Yeah.
toxic, as you said. Like, what was that transition like? How did you maintain the
Mhm.
progress you had made when you returned?
Yeah. I mean, it definitely was hard coming back. Like I said, physically distancing myself from that was one of the healing things. So when I came back, I was really concerned that I was going to relapse or kind of restart those, bad behaviors again. Um, so it was kind of a simple replacement in terms of using exercise instead of a negative relationship with food or an attitude towards food. So when I did feel stressed or anxious, I would think about binge eating, and then instead I would put my sneakers on and I would go out and start running. And from what I've learned about habit formation and conditioning and cues and all the things that are around you when you engage in bad behaviors like binge eating, when I removed myself from that, even just running outside of my own house, it took away that urge or desire to do that. I simply replaced, the proximity to food with being out next to the trees and running. And it kind of was at first a mental distraction, but then it really was like almost a replacement in terms of that need to do that.
Hmm. And I like that you put in some of the DSM, kind of
Mhm.
criteria for these
Yeah.
different illnesses. And it talks, in the bulimia criteria, it talks about these compensatory behaviors that
Mhm.
people do. So it's maybe there's a binge, maybe it's just the purging that can happen, or using laxatives or other medication, or actually, excessive
Mhm.
exercise.
Right.
And I found myself thinking about that as I was going through this, because not only are you running now, but you're doing ultra marathons. Like,
Mhm.
how do you kind of think about this being a healthy behavior as
Mhm.
opposed to something like the compensatory, excessive exercise that some people get caught
Mhm.
up in as part of their disordered eating?
Right. Yeah, I think it's a tricky question. I think there can always be, a cross addiction or replacing one habit with another. And I've often wondered along the journey, like, is this something that could be harmful, right? And really the way I look at that is I think, I'm when I exercise, it's not to compensate for anything that I've eaten or for anything other than to really like relax and just reduce anxiety and enjoy that feeling. Um, and I think if I was over exercising, there's a couple, I now am more aware of the warning signs and things to look for in terms of like, there's REDS, which is relative energy deficiency in sport and how that can affect women. There's also overuse injuries, so certainly as runners, if you're overdoing it, your body will tell you, and there will be, a tendonitis or a muscle strain or just general fatigue or things that would tell you that you're doing this excessively. So fortunately, I have not had any issues with that because I run for the enjoyment of running and then occasionally do these longer races and physical challenges, but I'm certainly not out running 4 or 5 hours a day just to burn calories. I think it's more of the mental perspective that's changed than anything else. Yeah.
Yeah, and you kind of point out, I mean, thinking for parents or coaches
Hmm.
who are trying to know like what are the different red flags.
Right.
You talk about those recurrent injuries or just
Hmm.
finding stress fractures and things if they're
Right.
just overtraining. And I think this is such a challenge right now because there is this overemphasis, I think, on
Mhm.
single sports, really constant year-round training, and have talked with people in the podcast about some of those topics. And
Right.
I'm wondering if you could flesh that out a bit of
Mhm.
what are some of the things to watch out for, talk a little bit more about the reds that you mentioned
Mhm.
and other things that we as adults can keep an eye out for in our children
Yeah.
and their friends, right?
Absolutely. Yeah, I think, it is important to remember, especially for teenagers who are engaging in sports that are, again, individual or sometimes put emphasis on aesthetic, appearances rather than performance. Things like running, gymnastics, those things tend to be a little bit higher risk in terms of eating disorders or disordered eating behaviors. So I think, things to look out for, again, include that over exercising to the point of fatigue, stress fractures, or overuse injuries. There can also be behaviors such as, let's say, restricting certain food groups or what we call like orthorexic behaviors, where there's a focus on being healthy, but almost to a point of rigidity where, you don't allow yourself to eat other foods. And for teenagers, and this includes what I experienced as well, there's a social isolation aspect to that too, where, a kid may not want to eat with others or go out or engage in social activities that revolve around food. So those are certainly some warning signs to look out for. And then REDS, which is called, or which is relative energy deficiency in sport, which we used to call the female athlete triad, is essentially a state of low energy availability that can happen in athletes, whether they're either restricting what they're intaking or if they're excessively exercising beyond, their energy intake. And some of the things that we can see with that include things like amenorrhea or loss of menstrual periods, which is something I experienced. There can also be, like I said, injuries, and that could be related to low bone density, anemia, and things like that medically. Um, so those are certainly, some things to look out for, and just to be more aware of. I do think, there are some coaches are aware of these symptoms and signs, but I think there still needs to be increased education and just general awareness of it, because I think a lot of female athletes especially still kind of go under the radar and may suffer with these conditions for a long time before they're treated.
Mhm. And now that you're in this phase of life and
Mhm.
do you consider yourself, I mean, I think some people have different narratives for how they describe no longer engaging in the disordered eating
Mhm.
patterns, but maybe sometimes having those kinds of thoughts come in, or those urges come
Yeah.
in and sort of
Mhm.
formulated as, in recovery or, that it's an ongoing process that, again, that challenge continues. Like, is that something that you face now? And what is it like to be kind of in your head right now around, food and exercise in your body?
Yeah. I think it's always a changing, evolving relationship, I would say. I've been free from those destructive eating patterns for almost a decade now. And so I do feel pretty confident with my, food choices and my relationship with food and how I feel about my body. But I also know that that's subject to change. One thing that's a concern is for women who are perimenopausal or going through menopause. Sometimes hormonal changes, just like what you experienced during menarche or the inverse of that, can actually trigger eating disorders again in people who have had them in the past. So I would say I'm optimistic, but I never fully let my guard down. Um, I would also say, just as an athlete, I try to be aware of what I'm eating in terms of, my energy levels and nourishing my muscles. But I also try not to be overly analytical about it. Because certainly in the past, having been so fixated on the numbers of calories I was eating or the number on the scale, I don't want to ever put myself in that position where I'm that rigid about numbers. And so I really just try to fuel myself, especially during races, with like nutritious foods and, high carbohydrate content, like energy gels and things that are going to get me through a race, but not worried about so much about the calories, or things that would have triggered me in the past. But
Yeah.
yeah, it's constantly changing. So
Mhm. That's interesting about the sort of menopausal transition, and that might be a
mhm.
time for triggering. It
Yeah,
makes sense.
yeah,
So you've worked so hard. I mean, you've overcome so many of these challenges. You're kind of living this full, rich life. I'm wondering what your like bucket list, dream, marathon or
yeah,
climb, or kind of what's on the list for you is sort of my last
yeah.
question. What's
Oh,
ahead?
sure. I mean, I like to keep things interesting. And so I never say I'm committed to doing like a certain distance or climbing Mount Everest, but I will say one of my bucket list items, which I am actually doing next year, is climbing Denali, which is the highest peak in North America. um, I'm very excited about that because, again, just as exercise and nature have been so integral in helping me heal and just keeping me happy, that is an extended trip on a mountain. So I'll actually be out for about 3 to 4 weeks on the mountain. And again, that requires a lot of physical and mental endurance to get through some of those conditions. But the rewards of, getting to a summit or just having that journey on the mountain to me are so important. So I'm really excited to do that.
Yeah, and I love those parts in the book. I'm not too familiar with ultra marathons or some of the climbing you described, but it really was so vivid and also so hopeful that this was something that you were really had shifted to and were really focused. And the emphasis on you feeling strong and
Mhm.
feeling sort of like resilient was just so clear and I think really inspiring. So
Oh, thank you.
yeah. So thank you so much for writing the book. I'll hold it up again. So Dr. Massone, who wrote this beautiful book, Running from Perfection. And where can listeners find out a bit more about the book or about you?
Oh, sure. So I am on social media. I'm on Instagram at Dr. Kate 23. And then I also have a personal website, CaitlinMassone.com, where you can see there's a few blog entries as well as photos from my expeditions and races. So you can definitely check it out
Wonderful.
there.
I will definitely look at those after we speak today. So thank you so much for joining me. This has really been an inspiring conversation and read, and I know will help a lot of people.
Well, thank you very much. It's been great chatting with you.
And just a reminder to listeners, we are both physicians, but we're not your physicians. So this is for informational purposes. If you have any concerns or questions, please contact your healthcare provider and get the care that you need. So thank you so much.